Welcome to Middle Fingers Up, the show where we hold our heads high and our middle fingers higher. I'm your host, Kieran McKay. Today I'm sitting down with Anusha, and I have a pretty cool story, well, at least I think so, about how we connected. And it's one of those stories where you can say that the magic of social media networking came together and actually worked well for once. I discovered Anusha through an insightful comment she made on a post by a fellow South Asian mental health advocate. And so after reading her comment, I looked her up and loved that she is all about supporting the South Asians with our issues with anxiety, guilt, and people pleasing. So she is a therapist who shares a lot of great tips on her socials at Jai with Anusha. She also co-hosts the podcast Talk South Asian to Me and is a dedicated mental health counselor based in Dallas, Texas. I'm so excited to sit down with her and break down anxiety and learn what kind of themes that may be showing up for her in her line of work. So welcome, Anusha, and thank you for being here on Middle Fingers Up.
Thank you, Karen. I feel honored to be on here. And also, thanks for reaching out from that comment. Yeah, that was really cool. I've just started, doing that, commenting and trying to get out there and basically engage with the community more.
Yeah.
And it's been really cool to see some people do actually reach out and they're like, that was so insightful. And I'm like, yes, engagement. Love it.
Totally. And you utilize your platform, you have a podcast. So you probably would also appreciate it when others, you put a question out or a comment out and someone else responds as well. And so I think it goes both ways. And so I'm kind of in the middle figuring out, what do I even know? What do I say? What do I ask? And so I'm always curious about the comments. And, there's so much to learn. So there's those of us that maybe don't feel as confident to write something or say something. But when we're reading them, I think we do take something from them. And I think that's also important for us to be mindful in how we post, but that's a whole different conversation. So you shared a lot about just the topic of sensitivity and how you may or may not have been as a kid, but just the negative ways that we look at being sensitive, that shy negative thing. And so I thought, I'm like, this person's so insightful. And then when I found your socials, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm learning thousands of things just by clicking on your little video. So really nice engagement. You have a really nice way of getting people's attention and putting information out in short little snippets. So nice work on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Yeah. So we should probably give a shout out to who that therapist is. It's the Brown Girl Therapy, Sahaj, right? And she just wrote a book, What Will People Say? Which
and I have that here too.
You have the book. I love
Always
it.
Next to me.
Oh, so good. I love that she named it that because that is literally the, phrase that we all grew up in, different versions of our languages and dialects, but that is exactly what all our families are in fear of. And the external measures, take precedence over the internal measures and all that kind of stuff. So really cool to have someone put it in book form. When you look at it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. Thanks for doing that for us. So how's the book coming along? Good stuff in there?
Yeah, I just started the other day because I just got my copy and I think it was 10 pages in, maybe not even. And I was already like, oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
She has such a wonderful way of making people feel seen and really, really resonating with the community, I think.
Oh,
that's why she's eloquent, I love it.
Yeah. I love that. I can learn from her. I'm so blunt. Sometimes the message is there, but the way it's said doesn't get across in the right way. And then people, so I definitely have to get the book. She's a therapist. You're a therapist. I see a therapist. So I've been on this thinking mode lately about racialized therapists all my life. I've had white therapists and never really thought about how a racialized therapist could benefit me. In fact, a lot of the years it was the opposite of having a brown therapist would be the opposite because they don't know they, got to get with the Western way. And that was the part of me that just really didn't want to live in the Eastern part of our growing up. And today in my 40s, I started to see a therapist again. And I've been talking about it lately and seeing a Punjabi therapist. And it is all the world of validation and everything in between. And so I just wanted to ask you, like, are you seeing more South Asians coming to therapy? And is there a conversation? Are they saying what their experience is being in the room with a brown therapist? Like, what's your experience around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, when I first had my exposure to therapy, when I was a client myself, I had a white therapist first too. And my first impression was, I'm kind of having to explain myself. I'm a little bit worried she's not going to quite really get it. Luckily, she did kind of get it. I mean, obviously she had lots of questions, but never like pushy or anything like that. And what I'm seeing now as a therapist on the other side of the seat, other side of the couch, I could say, is people seek me out specifically because I'm a brown therapist. But I think that's more so what I put out there, right? So a lot of my marketing, so to speak, on directories and all that kind of stuff is I really target the bicultural experience. I really acknowledge and say like, hey, do you feel like you're never quite fitting in one specific place in any one bucket? Do you really want to like unpack some of that? And so that's kind of how I started out initially when I came into the field. And so my like intention has always been towards getting back to this particular South Asian community and people, in similar situations. And I think that it resonates with the kind of people who seek me out.
Yeah.
Because they are looking for somebody who really gets that, who's neither maybe Eastern or Western, but a merged kind of messy both.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said. I agree with everything you literally said. As the client sitting in the chair and having my therapist before me. And, sometimes it's exactly what you said. Like, I didn't realize some of these things were missing until I sat with her and realized I was getting something that just, only someone that maybe looks like you has the exact same kind of experiences you would get. And so there's no right or wrong in that. It's just when you come from a racialized background, a lot of our issues growing up and then we become adults, in my opinion, are related to those gaps growing up in the Western Eastern world. But we don't realize that because some of us assimilate hard, some of us only surround ourselves around our community and so don't really have the Western influence. And so we're experiencing something different. There's all these different angles on how those gaps work for us or don't. And so I really learned a lot about those gaps I grew up in that my therapist helped me take responsibility over too. Like, it wasn't, it's that white person's fault or my mom's fault. It's just, okay, like, now what, right? And sometimes just being able to say the story without, like you said, breaking down the dynamics of what your dad's brother is and mom's sister, because there's so many different angles that way too. So it's really cool that we're seeing a lot more of our community trying to fill the gaps in the mental health system. And so kudos to the BIPOC community like you that are getting out there and going to therapy school so that we can start to make sense of our stuff too. So thank you for that. I appreciate that you went to therapy school for that.
That's sweet. Yeah. And honestly, I will say too, as an extension of this, what I've really noticed is I don't think it really, not always does it matter like the race or the background of the therapist, but what absolutely matters, and this is like, based on research, we know this, it's the relationship between the therapist and the client. That really is the number one indicator of success of therapy, more than the kind of therapy they use. And so I think that's another reason why when like these South Asians or anybody who is a BIPOC is coming to seek out other BIPOC professionals, they just feel a sense of like, I can be vulnerable. I can like let my guard down. Now, I know on the other hand, like you said earlier, right, there are definitely probably some people kind of still scarred from the community.
Yes.
Who are like, I don't know. But, you know, I think ultimately that's what it is. As long as you feel comfort and safety, there's a success there.
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely agree with that. So question, your specialization, as I mentioned in your intro, is anxiety, guilt, and people pleasing. And I'm like, oh my God, did you like peek through the bushes and like look at my life growing up and specialize in exactly what I struggle with? which then makes me think, no, I'm not a narcissist and I'm not the only important person. There's all of us that can share that, right? And it's so nice to get those words out. So I'm just curious because anxiety, like I worked in mental health for a significant amount of years. I have my own mental health stuff that I work with. So like, I get it. I love it. I'm around it. I educate myself. But anxiety is one of those things that probably way back in the day when the plague was happening and they were trying to explain germs and people couldn't see them. And they were like, what do you mean this exists? And that is how I see anxiety. Like it's sometimes hard even for me to make sense or explain what that is. So for you, having a child in the room, and maybe I can be that child because that's how my brain works. How would you describe to a child or in the simplest way to someone what anxiety could be?
That's a really good question. And I have got to refine my answer.
It's a loaded question. I'm sorry.
It's an important one. Well, it's an important one, I think, really, right? We get too bogged down in like these terms, but like, what does it really mean? If I really had to put a finger on it, I would say to me, anxiety, how I would explain to a child is it's the thing where we have lots and lots of thoughts overlapping over the other constantly. And we're trying to figure it out, but we just really can't. And it feels really like too much. Feels too much. That's how I would describe kind of anxiety to a kid.
Totally. It does. It feels like it's too much. And then there's all these symptoms that come out of that too much that I'm sure you and I will talk a little bit about. How does anxiety often show up for people? And maybe it is as a therapist and with the clients you work with. Like, are there themes that you see? Is it a symptom of certain presenting concerns? Like, what are the main things that you see a lot of us struggling with that are like you could put us all in the same room and like say, let me do a seminar with every single one of you. This is what we're seeing here.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a lot of what anxiety looks like for a lot of my clients is an intersection between the anxiety, sometimes even depression, and sometimes like people pleasing wrapped up with self-esteem. And that's why I call myself, a therapist for anxious people pleasers, is because it usually goes hand in hand, at least the people that choose to seek me out. And usually what specific things, really bring about all of that anxiety, the people pleasing, the low self-esteem is growing up, the relationships that we have with our parents, their coping styles, the way they communicate with us, the way that we disagree with difference of values. And then not just like all that stuff from the past, but like now, maybe even like as adult children, how does that show up for them? And they're usually stuck, right? They feel really stuck between wanting to not disappoint their family, their parents, their partners, maybe even, but also feeling like they can't be really true to themselves. They can't really do what they want to do, say what they want to say. They just feel so stuck in that push and pull of service to others and service to themselves. And so usually that's how, that's a context that we talk about anxiety and people pleasing generally. And specifically anxiety tends to come up with restlessness, this feeling of not doing enough and I have to do more, not being able to rest, not being able to just like sit and enjoy something.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that shows up as, like I said earlier, too many thoughts that feel too overwhelming.
Right.
Simply put, and sometimes that can show up if it's ignored long enough as physical symptoms. That can look like headaches. That can look like something I've been dealing with lately. I've actually noticed I've been clenching my jaw. I don't even know what I'm anxious about, but I need to take a closer look.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've been clenching my jaw and that's giving me lots of pain. And then, other physical symptoms can look like tummy aches, digestion issues, really anything.
Yeah. Do you ever find that sometimes anxiety is like contagious? Sometimes you have family member or loved one or someone in your relationship exhibiting it, and now you're picking it up too and don't maybe realize it. And it's like getting the flu now. Like you passed it on to me and I have it, but my symptoms might look a little different than your symptoms. And it's like we're just passing it back and forth to each other and don't recognize that, like, where did this anxiety ball of monster even come from? Like, do you see that in your work as well, that sometimes it's like this contagious factor by our environment?
That's a really, really good question. I never would have really saw it in that form since I do a lot of like individual work.
Yeah.
You just talk about people. I don't see people.
Right.
But I can definitely see how that would be. Yeah. Because we have these really cool things called mirror neurons.
Yeah.
The thing where if I yawn, you're going to probably yawn. If I cry, you're going to start to feel like crying.
Right. Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing. Our emotions tend to carry this like energy that we can't see, right? So anxiety has a very like fidgety kind of energy.
Right.
And so people are seeing that, and then they're hearing you talk about your anxious thoughts, and that are maybe a little bit spirally. They're just going from one thing to the other, another thing, and they just continuously get more like catastrophic what ifs.
Right.
That is very contagious. Now the other person's going to feel a little bit of that unease, even if they're not picking it up fully.
Yeah.
They're going to feel a little bit of something.
Yeah.
After interacting with you now.
Right. Yeah. And I wonder if like when we dig deeper later on with some like historical stuff too, like I wonder if that's where some of that contagious factors is just passed on when we look at our genetics and epigenetics and all that lovely stuff that we're learning through intergenerational trauma too. Let's talk a little bit about how can anxiety help us? How can it be there for us in ways that we don't maybe realize it can be helpful?
Anxiety can help us, really? I'm just kidding.
Yeah, what?
That's what all clients say. Usually they're like, what? How is this a good thing to have? But yeah, our anxiety, like all of our emotions, really, like anger, even guilt, they have a purpose. Usually part of that purpose is in service of us, right? So anxiety, for example, have you seen Inside Out 2, by the way?
Have not yet. Only my oldest has. So we got to get there. I know. I can't wait. I had 2 therapist friends go see it for work. They're like, you need to go. I'm like, okay.
It's amazing.
I will do it this weekend.
Been great. Awesome. I can't wait. Okay, you're going to have to let me know.
Okay, I will message you after. Yes.
It was amazing. And I bring it up because literally, I think anxiety is something that a lot of people feel, especially being in my field. I see it more often. And so I keep telling everybody, you need to go watch it. Like, you're going to feel so seen, so heard, and you're going to cry. But it does a really wonderful job of depicting what anxiety looks like, feels like, and what it can do when it's balanced, when it's at its healthiest. And so without too much spoilers, what it ends up being is essentially anxiety. It helps you prepare for the things that you can't see, but that are reasonable anticipations that might come true. Right. So let's say
I'm just having an aha moment. That's what that was. If you're like, when you were like, I was like, yeah, no, I was like, oh,
that makes sense. It's all dawning on you now. But yeah, it is. And if you really like break it down like that, like it doesn't seem so scary. But when we give it the power to take over, it spirals. It goes out of control. Right. But when we can, basically treat it like a messenger of, okay, what are you worried about? What do you see upcoming? What do you want to plan for? Okay, I got a plan for that. Yeah, good point. When you can like, it sounds silly, but like talk to it like that, then you can actively use what it's saying to prepare, but then you have to be in charge. You have to think about it kind of like boss employee or parent and kid. You're in charge. They are coming to you. And what they have to say is valid. There's a point, there's a purpose, but they're not in charge. You are. So taking back that control and really seeing anxiety or any other emotion for that matter as a helpful thing is basically recognizing that they're messengers. We can hear what they're saying and we do the execution of what they're saying.
I love that. So with the messengers, sometimes we don't get all of our mail delivered to us. The mail gets lost on the way, or, the whole lost in translation. So kind of 2 questions. So when the messengers are trying to help us, what is it that we can be doing to remain at that preventative, like, oh, these are signs, this is, and should we miss it and find ourselves missing it, and now we're snowballing into our anxiety, cycle? Is there a way that we can find our way back faster to the place of like, let me get back in charge or control?
I think that the first thing that's really important to recognize with this is, one, if you feel like things are just kind of happening and you're not really sure what is happening, that's a good place to start. A lot of the things that we talk about start with being mindful, being aware of what's happening. So if you're not sure what's happening, that's what we got to work on first, is getting you more aware. So what that can look like for some people, like some of my clients who, are like from the motherland, so to speak, who maybe aren't as well versed in like therapy and mental health. What I really do and try to create a foundation for them, identifying, observing, what is going on. So what that looks like is tuning in, not always the intellectualizing, but tuning into the body, right? So what are you feeling right now? Usually they have a hard time with that. And so I have this like emotion wheel I found online. I don't know who created it, but it's super helpful. It's amazing. And it helps you break down from like the simple emotions like happy, sad, and then like gets more and more specific. And so I work with them to say like, okay, when you feel this emotion, can you think of a time you felt that way? Where did you feel that in your body? It's just really start helping them like identify how to tell when you feel a certain emotion.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing with like anxiety. I think in our community, sometimes anxiety can be just seen as like stress, but it's more than that.
Okay.
And so being able to really put a name to something, awareness when it's happening, putting a name to it is the first step in all of this. Now, if you find yourself like kind of being aware, but you're not really implementing some of these like tools and you find yourself like, ooh, we spiraled into snowball somewhere. I would say the best thing to do, walk our way back slowly. Always first regulate. So what does that mean? Regulate means, when you are in a overwhelmed state of anger or anxiety or sadness or any emotion, you just feel it too much. Your nervous system is kind of going haywire. It's not feeling very like settled. And you'll know that because maybe your heart is beating too fast. Maybe your face feels really warm. Your body's heating up. Maybe your hands feel really clammy and sweaty. Right. So there are physical sensations, even your breath not being very even, that indicate when you are dysregulated. So regulating is a really good way to first tap into our logic, being able to rein it back, that control. Because I'll give you an example, right? I tell my clients all the time, I'm not trying to be demeaning here, but it's a great example. When you see a kiddo and the kiddo is crying, having a tantrum, having big feelings, are you going to be able to logic your way into getting them to stop crying? No. What you need or what they need is comfort, is love, is just a hug, at first to help soothe their regulation so that their nervous system calms down, they stop sobbing. And then once they're calm, truly, truly calm, then you can try to like logic your way through this conversation. They'll be more willing to understand. We're the same way, even as grown adults.
Yeah. Can I add two things to what I love that you just said? I'm just imagining, like aunts and great uncles and just our community sitting in a space where they can have this kind of a conversation with someone like you. Because you pointed out something so big, and I don't honestly think I even thought about it until you said it, anxiety and stress. Like those things, totally. How many times do we hear that from our parents or grandparents or caregivers? I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed, I'm stressed. And you're like, take a chill pill, man. And you just need to relax, whatever things we say. But often I wonder how many times, like even in my own household with my parents or my grandparents, stress is there, you're right. But how much was it of that unidentified anxiety of these weird, like to me, sometimes anxiety feels like when you drink too much coffee, too much caffeine in you, and you're like, It just these weird, jittery kind of vibes that sometimes you're right, aren't necessarily stress. My question is, do you spend time with your clients looking at the differences and similar? Like, does that come up quite a bit, anxiety and stress?
Actually, no. So a lot of my clients typically are other bicultural folks. So typically they come in with that vocabulary. Now, I've been recently really cool. I don't know what's changing this, but it's super cool. I've been getting more and more people, like, as I put it, from the motherland straight,
Yeah.
So I feel like with them, I'm noticing some like pushback of, no, that's not me. This is what I am. And I'm like, okay, I see what you're saying, but kind of potato.
Yeah.
And so kind of explaining like that difference of, stress to a certain degree, super normal, but anxiety is like a very specific thing that's different than stress.
Yeah.
And like, if you want to call it stress, cool. I'm not here to split hairs around this, but what are we going to do about it? Right. So, sometimes I think that if there's like a little bit of that pushback or that resistance, because sometimes it can feel scary, I've noticed, for sometimes these big words, if you're not used to it, being thrown out there, like, oh, this is what you're experiencing. It's like, what? No, I'm not. I don't want it.
Yeah.
I want no part of this.
Yeah. And
so like, I try not to like hone in. I'm like, yeah, no, that is what it is.
Totally.
I try to be like, okay, that's cool.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, so I think that meeting people where they're at is important.
Yeah. Yeah.
I try to explain it. It comes up sometimes with certain kind of clients, but not usually.
Well, I think there's something there to like continue to tap into, because I don't know, when I heard you say it, I was like, yeah, mostly the women of the generations before, I feel like there is like a great focus group to do just like to help get to the bottom of how that overlaps so much, and also breaking stigma, because I think sometimes it's far more manageable or acceptable to tell someone you're stressed than to say you have anxiety. Like to hear your mother, your grandmother, your aunt, or whoever, uncle, whoever that may be, say I have anxiety, or to them to share with other people, there's like a foreign concept almost, and maybe doesn't mean in the same way, but we all know what stress means. And so sometimes I think even just the language of it, but the bottom line is like matters not, like you said, what it's called, it's how do we address it? Because some stressors, we address things differently than with anxiety, and anxiety can turn into stress if we can, kind of, like you said, manage it or catch it when the messenger's sending those notes to us. And then the other thing that you had mentioned was when you were talked about anxiety and stress with that, you had said that some of your clients are immigrants that are just learning, being educated. Thank goodness. Also, kudos to them that are showing up to therapy, by the way, like huge, amazing stuff for them. Those basic things of acknowledging just the physical symptoms like you were talking about. And it got me thinking too about like how many of our ancestors and elders like have not had a true understanding of where some of that physical pain, like where did it originate from when we do talk about intergenerational trauma. And I know there's lots of still people think it's a hokey thing to say. Oh, intergenerational. Okay, sure, that can get pat, but it can change your DNA. It can change the story of your life. And when we see our grandpas and grandmas and aunts and uncles, you see so many physical ailments and so many things going on. And I'm just curious, when you have someone from the motherland, whether it's an elder or a young person, but still motherland talking, how are they making sense of, oh, this physical pain could be connected to my anxiety or my stress? Like, does that connection sort of form? Or is that also like a little bit of a, wait a minute, no, I got this because I was carrying the groceries in or something like that?
That's fair. There's lots of reasons for these things. But yeah, I think a lot of it usually is met with a little bit of surprise and a little bit of like, oh, really? You sure?
Yeah.
Because I really don't think it's something that's talked about enough. I don't really think it's really well known or even normalized for that matter.
Yeah.
I feel like this is still kind of new to people. I feel like people are just starting to talk about it, at least as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I would agree.
In my circles. So I feel like there's just a lot of surprise around this still. And I think that there's a little bit of like, oh, really? And I think even some disbelief, not from clients per se, but like when I talk about it to like family members or like just having conversations outside of therapy, there is a sense of disbelief too of like, really? Can that even be true?
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of normalizing left to do around it.
I agree. And I think even like when we take a minute here and talk about just historical, factors that occurred, just only I can say for the South Asian community, it got in the way of us. Like we said, we're a little behind, right? We're not at the same time because it's impacted our generational learning. And I sometimes wonder, even like I talk to my parents about it, and sometimes it feels like they're just getting permission to talk about historical factors because how history was written weren't always in the same ways, and how the Western world, who has such an influence, shares some of the historical factors, right? Settler colonization, all that's what I'm talking about in India. When you talk to some of our elders, there's very vagueness in how it's talked about as well, because so much wasn't passed down. And what was skewed in some ways, and maybe not in some other families or not. So it's interesting when I even talk to my own parents, like they're like, oh, it's like, we can talk. What? Like, okay, then let's do it. Let's talk, and then now it's like slowly like, this makes sense where some of the connections could be for us, because people think it's so far removed. But it's not, right? Yeah. Anything you want to add to that, or that stands out for you?
I think when I think of intergenerational trauma, what's coming up a lot right now in this moment is scarcity. So I see a lot of scarcity beliefs, like a not enoughness in our conversations, in the things that we believe, in what's passed down. And there is a very good reason for that. We did at a time, like back in our history, there was a scarcity multiple times. It makes sense. But the way that it shows up now, for example, is hoarding, not wanting to let go of things because we might have use for them. In the picture behind you, right, in the painting that we were talking about, having covers on remotes because you don't want them to get bad, just in case of something happening. There's all little ways that the scarcity can show up even now, like somewhat innocuous ways, but also like deeply difficult ways. Our physical health. South Asians are one of the populations that have diabetes very often. But what is our primary staple? Rice. But it's because of that scarcity that we experienced a long, long, long time ago, and how that shaped our bodies. So, there's just so many ways when we talk about intergenerational trauma and how it shows up in our behaviors, our mental health, and our physical health. It really does need to be talked about more and normalized more.
I agree. Yeah. I just am in my 40s and only learning. My story started long before I was born, but often, we forget that our parents' stories didn't start when ours did. Like we miss out on that. And I did, at least. And, getting to this age, realizing, holy crap, like my parents had their own stuff that they had to carry through, and stuff that they didn't even know how to make sense of when they were born, based on, now we're learning about the chemical releases when a woman is carrying a baby, and what can be passed. So there's all these different things that you and I are addressing that happen even in the womb, let alone before. It's kind of written, right? And your story's sort of written in the stars in a way. And that doesn't mean this is the way we are and that's it. It just means for me, I'm learning it's so important to try to start at the beginning, not the middle of our stories. And where is the beginning, and how does that history impact where we are? You're right, helps us understand health issues and where does diabetes come from and all that kind of stuff. So I think the more we talk about it, the more everyone else is going to have to. I don't know, right?
So, I hope so.
Right? Because it's there. It's necessary. So I'm glad at least we got two of us talking about it. So that's better than nothing, right? So let's back it up. So we got right into anxiety. Can you share with us, what's the story that led you to specialize in anxiety and all of this, as well as go to school to work in mental health?
Well, I'm going to have to back it up even further. When I was in elementary school, the furthest back I can possibly remember, around 4th grade, I remember being told a lot, oh my God, she's such a patient person. She's such a good listener. And people would jokingly say, she'd be such a good therapist. She's my therapist. And back then, obviously it's a double-edged sword, compliments like that. But I really took that and I ran with that. I was like, oh, that gives me so much pride. And the more I learned about psychology, I did in my undergrad, I did a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology. In high school, I took a psychology AP course. I fell in love with the idea of psychology and human nature. And it was just so fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of what I wanted to do. But, my parents had a very typical Indian, you got to be a doctor.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, well, I can be a psych major in university and go on the pre-med track. Quickly realized, that is not for me. I'm flunking out of genetics. This is not happening.
It's a lot. I'm glad you quickly realized that and you didn't put yourself through way more than you needed to get to that, because that's a lot.
Yeah. I feel I knew a little bit, but I was like, okay, I can give it a shot.
Yeah.
I can see what it's really like. Yeah, maybe I really don't fully know what it could look like. So I thought, okay, I can maybe do psychiatry. But no, immediately I was like, no, this is not for me. So that came at a time, though, when I was under a lot of self-perceived stress, I'll say. And I didn't really have the tools to really handle it. My mom, bless her soul, she's amazing, but she was very much a positive, go-getter person. And so she instilled in me a lot of positive things. I'm hey, smile. It's okay. We got this. It's fine. No big deal. And I tried to embody that most of my life. And that was fine most of the time. But sometimes, particularly when I got into my undergrad years, when I was experiencing more, I had more freedom. I didn't have my parents around all the time. So it was different kind of stress, different kind of environments that I was being exposed to. And I was not very well equipped to handling the negative emotions I was feeling.
Yeah.
And I obviously suppressed it because we got to be positive. We got this, right? That, that track that was running in my head. So basically that ended up with me having a really, 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 really bad diagnosis for hypothyroidism. I say bad because I've ignored it for so long that when I eventually saw the doctor on campus, and it wasn't even because I wanted to go see him. We had just finished, I think midterms or finals it was. And I was walking back to my apartment with my roommate and my friend, and I couldn't walk. I had so much salt retention that every single step was literal agony. And at a certain point, I literally could not move anymore. And she's like, "You're literally crazy. I'm calling your mother." And she calls my mom. They make me go to the doctor. I don't know why I was so stubborn. I really don't. And I was just in deep denial, basically. And they said that if I had waited any longer, it's possible I could have gotten a coma because I've never seen levels that high before. And I was like, what? Oh my God, really? I did not believe it, but I saw the results and I was like, yeah, that's kind of crazy.
Wow.
And yeah, right. And I basically, that was kind of like a turning point for me because I realized, oh my God, I've suppressed so much and now I'm angry that I have this thing to deal with on top of everything else I'm dealing with. And it kind of makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. And I had a lot of anger, basically. And again, I was a very positive person for most of my life. I did not know what to do with this anger. I was so confused by it. So eventually, my roommate and I, we were both going through different kinds of things. And we were like, let's do therapy together on campus. So we went to, the therapy, and it was just amazing. It was literally absolutely amazing because even though it was really, really difficult to talk about these things, share really vulnerable pieces that I've never really voiced even to myself, it felt safe to be vulnerable. And so with that safety, I was able to for the first time, really truly question curiously some of my beliefs and the norms that we had, and really find where the source of all this anger, this resentment, this people pleasing, where does this all come from? Why is it happening the way that this has been happening? And now, many, many years later, being a therapist, I think just this year or last year, I realized actually that the thyroid diagnosis, which was soon followed by PCOS diagnosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome, really common, I realized that those were stress induced. So what that means really is sometimes we have in our genetics specific kinds of mental health or physical health issues, but they don't get, for lack of a better way to explain it, they don't get turned on unless there's some significant stressor to turn them on. So going through university, not having the tools to cope with literally anything other than happiness, that was my significant stressor that turned on these mental health issues. It all worked out because eventually I was like, yeah, this is amazing. I want to be a therapist. She made me feel so good. She made me feel like I'm on top of the world now. And eventually it was just really affirmed for me what I always knew, which was, yeah, I think this is what I want to do. I want to give back to people. I want to make them feel seen, validated. That was always, a strength of mine, but knowing exactly what that can look like, that highlighted even more yeah, this is my calling, genuinely.
Yeah. That's a great story to share. Thank you for that. I really appreciate you talking about what is so possible and it's kind of a perfect story for what we've been talking about when we don't manage what happens in our mind and in and on our bodies. And now, knowing what you know and having gone through what you have, is there something that you would say to the grade 4 you that everyone thought was so patient and so sweet and a good listener and always so positive and happy? What would you go back and anything you would go and tell her different than what you thought you were doing back then?
Yeah, definitely. I see some of those traits in some of my lovely little younger cousins now. And I'm fortunate enough, we've just come back to our hometown. So I get to see them growing up. And when I notice similar kind of vocabulary, I'm always to just get in there and be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. You don't have to do this, girl.
You're like, I'm your future.
Yeah. Don't no, I know where you're going. Nope. We're going to shut that down. But really, I think, what I would say and what I do say is listen, you are a good girl, but you're a good girl for so many reasons. You're not just a good girl because you follow instructions, because you're so thoughtful, those do make you a good girl, but you're also a good girl for just being honest, for
Yeah.
asking for what you want, for
Yeah.
taking up space, like that's okay too. So I think if anything that I would go back and say to myself, it would be that we don't always have to be smiling. We don't always have to be happy to be happy. Feeling our emotions can be really like good release so that we can be happy. They give us something necessary to understand about ourselves so that we can be happy, to really hone in, like it's a balance that's needed.
Oh my gosh. Like, can we just spend a little bit of time on this happy part? Because I think there's so many brown kids that are adults now that may be listening, or someone will tell them to listen to this, because I think so many could probably share, maybe not to what your outcome was, but just that feeling of you got to be happy, like, first of all, you have family that's like sacrificing their life, immigrating from the motherland. And some of it, not all of the stories are all good. Some of them are for safety reasons and all these things. And so you grow up trying, be grateful. Like you said, the remote control, right? Like all of that. And so when you grow up thinking, yeah, be grateful, got to be happy, got to be positive, we lose sight of what is happiness. Happiness is only the yay stuff. And even though we tell ourselves, you can cry, it's okay, we still want to be happy because that's the preferable emotion. And that's the more acceptable, more successful one. So what's the thing to say next, or the conversation or the question to ask, or maybe even your response to all those brown kids out there, and maybe kids from other communities too that can relate to this, that grew up thinking you got to be happy, and now as adults feel so guilty because maybe they're not happy.
Yeah, definitely. I would say that happiness is just another emotion. You are not happy. You feel happy. That's a temporary emotion. If it's temporary, you're meant to embody other emotions temporarily too, right? So if you feel whatever you feel, upset, sad, angry, resentful, anxious, whatever it is, there's a reason for it. But if we approach it with the judgment of you have to be happy, you should be this, you shouldn't be this, then we're never going to get out of our spirals of what we feel. They're never going to be temporary. They're going to last longer and longer and longer. But if we just approach it with loving curiosity, like you would to just anybody else, you think, what are you going through? Why? What's going on? If you do that for yourself, then you can see, like, it's just a temporary emotion. You'll figure out why you're in this space, and then you'll be able to think, okay, so what are my options here? What can I do? And it's not that the idea is necessarily to jump out of it and get to happiness, but I prefer the term like neutralness, where you're maybe not like jumping with joy, but you're just kind of like, you're neutral. You're content. You're satiated.
You're safe. You're grateful for that. But maybe you're not, like you said, jumping on a couch, yelling, I'm so happy. You made an interesting point about the turn off, turn on switch. And I really like that. Sometimes our genes, have different definitions of what our mental health is going to be like you said, our physical health, all these things in our genes. And some things don't get turned on. I could be a diabetic, but that may never get turned on. But then if I really don't eat well enough and take care of myself, that switch can turn on. And so same thing with mental health. In my genetics, in my history, there's all these sorts of things. And when I, let's say, don't know am not taught how to cope with everyday anxiety, stressors, these things, it can lead to an extreme thing like my switch of how my mental health, maybe health issues are going to switch on. I really like how you did it. I butchered it, but you explained it so well. And so sometimes I think about us as young adults, and I've been there, and I never was extreme, but I know of brown kids growing up who at 18, at 19, by 21 had a really big switch go off, and like those really big sexy mental health diagnoses that we don't know much about, borderline or schizophrenia, very, very severe depression, things like that. Can we spend just a couple minutes on that? I know you're here for anxiety and all that, but I also know our community's listening. And sometimes we do the best we can as parents, but we don't know the things we could be doing. So if we could talk a little bit about parenting and how to help manage those light switches going on and off. Can we take a few minutes of that? Yeah. Any knowledge you can pass on to us?
So what I heard you say was essentially like for parents who are wondering about the on and off switch, what you have control over in that. How do you deal with that if it does happen?
Yeah.
That kind of.
Yeah. Because I think like there's things we don't know that are in our genes. And then we're like, how did this happen? And then we use words like she's crazy or something like that. Right. And it didn't just happen. Some of it's part of our genetics and some of it is environmental, and they go hand in hand. The environment will probably help decide if the switch is going to be turned on or off for us.
Totally. Yeah. I will say, like, I will not call myself an expert on this topic, but I will say that I have a couple of parents who come in, a lot of moms typically, and a lot of the things that we talk about is like, listen, you got to focus on what you can control. I know it's easy to be anxious. I mean, this person is your heart walking around outside your body. I get that. But we can either spiral in that anxiety and get stuck in it, or we can try and rein it back, and we can try and focus on what are the things that I can control in this anxiety that is worrying about the specific thing. And in the rest of it, I say, see it as an opportunity to model to our kids, taking that deep breath and modeling to them like, hey, I can't control everything. That's cool. I can regulate, and I try to spin it in that way because that really hits home for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I say like, you can't control what you can't control. They're like, that's not good enough. And I'm like, what if you have to use it as an opportunity to model? And they're like, okay, yeah, makes sense.
Fair. Fine, I'll do it.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, really that's what it ultimately comes down to is we don't know what we don't know. Mm-hmm. But if you do know that there might be, I don't know, like thyroid issues that run in the family, maybe educating, I'm like, what are those things that are healthy for a functioning thyroid? Are there specific foods I can make sure they incorporate and they know why we're eating these foods on a day to day? That's a little bit more nutrition based, but
but still, right? Like, What I hear you saying is for all of us, like, we can do the 23andMe gene thing and get all our health stuff, right? That way. But for many of us, it is about, like you said, paying attention to what is our history. Like maybe our aunts and uncles or grandparents didn't get a formal diagnosis, but I think, we can find out how was their health, how was their mental health, how was their emotional health, how was their physical health. Like, are there some things that we should prepare for? And I also hear you saying like education around, I think just even when can this come out? What is happening in our environment?
The symptoms. What would it look like?
Totally. And we, like you said, we can't prevent everything. We can't control everything. Some of these light switches turn on and off on their own too. Those things happen. But at the end of the day, knowing that, okay, there are mental health issues in my family will really help me to pass that on to my boys as they get older. And just so that they are aware and can prepare should something come up. As the same as my mom calling me every day, did you get your eyes checked for glaucoma? Your grandma had it. That's her thing, right? So, we're really good with the physical stuff, but I think the mental health stuff too, if we can start to pay attention to some of that. Let's talk a little bit about guilt if we can. Yeah.
Love it. My favorite topic.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Okay. So I watched, first of all, I want to tell everyone, like, please go visit Anusha at Jai with Anusha. We'll have your socials up. You can mention them again at the end here. You have so many educational videos, short, sweet, really hit home. One of my favorite ones was a video about guilt. And something you said in there stood out and I had to write it down. And I'm wondering if we can break it down. And what you said was just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you have anything to feel guilty for. And, you think about it and you're like, yeah, of course. But no, it's just one of those things that's so simple that it tricks you to think it's so simple, but it's so hard to follow. Like, how many of us wake up with guilt, go to bed with guilt? We're cleaning our house. We're doing all these things. We have that hustle culture, go, 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 all these things that we have guilt about. And if someone were to ask, what are you guilty about? Half the time it's hard to know what it is. And you think, well, it's probably, something bad I did, or I deserve to feel this way. So I'm just curious, what made you say that? And what does that mean? Like, help us understand. Please help me. This is where the therapy with me begins.
Okay, so this is where I start the clock.
Yeah. US dollars too. Darn it.
Really, I really, really do love talking about guilt. And it's because it is so widely, commonly felt in our community.
Yeah.
Right. And I mean, I think that first we have to take it a little bit further back for a second here. Guilt, usually from an intergenerational trauma perspective and a mental health intergenerational trauma perspective, guilt is something that's kind of been weaponized, and we have used that throughout the generations. I don't know where it started, not sure, still wondering. But if you really think about it, I bet you could find at least one person in your childhood who guilted you into something, or at least you've heard someone's experience of an elder guilting them into something. Why? That didn't come from nowhere. It's because they were guilted, and they were guilted by their elders, right? So I think it's important to recognize, like I said earlier, all our emotions have a function. But sometimes growing up, our emotions get a little bit skewed on what their baseline is. For most of us, what I've found is we've all had the collective experience of seeing guilt used as a weapon against us. If you do this, then I'll feel sad. You don't want to make me sad, do you? You know, those kinds of subtle, not so subtle, emotional manipulation pieces. And like, I don't think that most of the time people realize they're doing that.
Yeah.
It's not their fault, right? This is a thing that we're perpetuating. Sometimes it is intentional. I won't take away from those experiences, but the idea is when those things happen, it's inevitable that our guilt believes and sits with us because it believes it needs to be there. It needs to remind us that we're doing something wrong, right? It almost becomes like a habit. It's a muscle memory thing because that's what we've experienced for so long. So now what ends up happening is we don't know why we feel guilty. It just comes up randomly. And in those moments, just like it is with the moments that maybe we do know why, we just have to evaluate it. We have to be curious to it. You'll find me say a lot, curious.
Yeah.
There's a reason, you know. The more curious that we are, we're tapping into, I can go really forever on this topic, but let me try to break it down.
I would love for you to go forever. I just cleared my card, so I got like 5 hours, so take your time.
We're just going to go for 5 hours.
We'll make it like a 10-part series, no problem. Because it's you can go for hours because we all tell you that we all show up, right? And you probably also have your own experience. Like this is something that we can all share.
Yeah.
Is because you're right. Like it's gotten results over, sometimes you don't even have to use your words. You can just say, oh my God, can you just go get the laundry? This is what I say to my kid all the time. Oh, can you just get the laundry for me? Like that statement is enough for him to like be guilted to like better help my, mom and her sore leg, right? Do you know, right? We do it all the time. It's so true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. But I will also like to give you a little bit of credit. That one's a little bit different.
Okay, fair.
He wants to help because it hurt,
Oh, perfect. I'm doing it as a life lesson to teach him. I love this. Thank you. One less thing to be guilty.
But, really, this guilt that we tend to feel for no reason. If you feel it for no reason, get curious. Why do you think you feel it for no reason? How often do you feel guilty? When are earliest memories that you have about feeling guilty? What were those situations like? What were you doing? And I think it's also important to note here, like guilt and shame. Let me quickly break that down. Shame is more about like if something goes wrong, because that went wrong, I'm dumb, I'm stupid, I'm wrong. Versus guilt is I've done wrong. Shame is a lot deeper to unpack. Usually guilt shows up more in my experience. Thankfully, that's a little less to dig up, but still a lot. And as I tell people all the time too, like, listen, if you have something that's been so ingrained in you for so many decades now, it's not going to just go away.
Yeah.
You're going to have to really try hard every time it comes up as often as you can to rewire that thought, essentially, right? So every time it comes up, replace that thought with this new thought of curiosity. Oh, have I done anything to be guilty for? What did I do wrong? And ask with this new version of who you are, not the old version growing up, but this new version. the values that you have, the priorities that you have, the skills that you have, the experiences that you have, does this version of you believe that you're doing something wrong now? Would you also believe that it's wrong if a partner, a friend, a niece or nephew, a daughter or son, if they were doing this, would you see them as being wrong too? Usually the answer is no. The answer is no. You're not doing anything wrong either.
Yeah.
Right. And I think taking that a step further is also recognizing then, what do you do with that? You just feel it. You know you're not doing anything, but you feel it. What do you do with that?
Yeah. What do you do with that?
What do you do with that? Let's get into that. One, it's a bit of a perception thing, right? It's recognizing that the stronger our perception is that we can feel guilty without having anything to feel guilty for, the less weight it carries. We kind of strip away its power. The more that we say it, the more that we believe it, the more that we practice this new way of thinking. Now, what do you do with the actual feeling part is you regulate, you breathe around this feeling. You figure out, where does it show up on your body? What does that feel like? And I usually have some kind of visualization of like how to release it from a very visual place that ends up being really powerful. You know, I don't know how to describe it perfectly, but essentially like where you feel it, what does it feel like? Does it have a temperature? Does it feel like if you had to like draw it, illustrate it, what would you say to me? And then from there, we talk about like, if it's kind of like almost pins and needles in your chest, then I've had people, like I've told people like, okay, let's take deep breaths. And on your exhales, I want you to see, like visualize those pins and needles moving a little bit further and further away from you. You know, just kind of visualization like that. But the idea is regulate your nervous system when you feel dysregulated by this icky thought. And then just distract if you can't get rid of it still. Because over time, you will lessen that feeling. Yeah. But sometimes time just takes time to happen. So after you've done what you can do addressing it, if it still lingers, distract. That's okay. In temporary form, distractions are great coping skills. In a long-term form, we can't just keep distracting.
Right. Yeah. And you know, when you've been living that, let's say the guilt for 20, 30, 40, 50, however many years, like it's a lot to unlearn. That's like 30, 40, 50 years of unlearning. So we have to also have a little bit of that compassion for ourselves that, like you said, that distraction can be sort of helpful to take those feelings away. And I also like that you said short term, over time, hopefully we've identified it. We can catch it. You know, those questions are important because often, you know, when I asked that, I followed your exercise along the way and I was like, yeah, like it's sometimes it comes from our childhood. And then if we've been, you know, in our partnership or marriage or relationship for so many years, we bring those things into those relationships, but then they form their own kind of, you know, like way of you and your partner might have that with each other, right? Like cleaning's a big one. If you're not doing enough indoor, outdoor chores, then it starts to feel like I got to do more or what. I think sometimes when you have a partner involved, like I know for me, my husband knows that I need his help because I have to go to him and say, I have to clean, I have to do these things, I have to do this and this, but I'm just going to take the time to rest and that because I need permission. Like that's my thing. Right. When you grow up and you're told what to do and then you live in a world where you're told to do. And then, you know, I'm a rule follower. So like, I think like you ask those questions, it does help us go down the path of being curious and where does my journey of guilt come from versus yours or whatnot. And what do we do to manage that? So what are the things that come up or the maybe like the resistance that comes up in sessions when you talk about guilt where we're not ready yet to accept?
Usually it's when this old belief, whatever's the root of this feeling. So the way that it works, right, is we don't just like technically have feelings. Our feelings come from our thoughts. The belief that we have, the perception that we have, that's the thing that elicits emotion. So if our thought is deeply entrenched and deeply like rooted in this thing, that's when we face like resistance. It's like, no, but this is true. There's no room. There's no wiggle room. There's no other alternative. This is true. That's when we really get into it. So like, for example, with guilt, sometimes what I see in like patterns is if you've been told that sitting around reading, if that was your passion growing up, is like lazy, like you could be doing this because this is the right thing to do. What are you going to do in the future when you have to serve your family or like, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
That's a big one that comes up for a lot of people. And that's like deeply rooted. Oh, I should be, usually it's a should. I should be cooking right now with my time. I should be cleaning with my time.
Yes.
I shouldn't be lazing around reading a book.
Oh my gosh. Seriously. Yes, please bill me, because that is exactly it. It's those kinds of things as kids. And again, we always say this is no, anything at our parents growing up. Everybody was doing the best they could. But I remember that. I remember the reading. I remember the drawing, the creative things, the sitting around and literally unwinding. Like, it's okay to be bored. And those things we just didn't know how to do because our parents didn't do it. So why would we do it? And now you're right. Like, when we have to sit down and watch something, there's so much guilt. Both my husband and I have, because we're like, we should be doing something to do with the kids or whatever, right? And so I think that, like, you really hit the nail on the head with that, because that's something that many of us would relate with, is that should be doing something more or different that's, not this unwinding exercise. Or we didn't really grow up living in transitions. It was like, one thing to another. It wasn't there wasn't always a lot of downtime, right? And now we're growing up in a time where we talk a lot about transitions, the drive home from work, summers to school, like all those little things that we didn't realize, right? And so when you don't recognize how you need that to fuel to get to the next thing, I can see where some of that guilt may come in. So look at you letting me have aha moments right now. It's so nice.
I love that. Yeah, I'm so glad. And, to your point, really, I have to say, like, this is something I always try to highlight to all my clients, because they feel this so deeply, right? And I keep telling them, like, I get it. I know you love your parents. It doesn't mean anything bad about them. But listen, they were the generation that survived. We're the generation that gets the privilege to thrive. So let's take that opportunity. Let's thrive. And now, hopefully, if our parents have also kind of settled down from this, the survival phase, they might have opportunities to thrive.
Yeah.
We can model that. We can pave the road for them. And in that way, show if we have that gratitude, we can show them that.
I love that. That's a really cool way. I never really thought of it, because we always think the future, our children or us, but also look at our past. We can still, that's literally going back and making cute changes within our past by working with our parents, teaching them if, like you said, we're in that place and we can do that. So
if they're willing and able to do that.
Totally. Right. Absolutely. We have all these different, again, angles to how that goes. But I like that you put it that way, though, because even those of us that maybe can't go back and fix some of those things, go back and have those conversations or redo things, I think the fact that we have the awareness and can do it with ourselves sometimes is forgiving in itself. And at least, again, recognizing that, okay, maybe we don't have the ability or resource to go back there and do that, but I can do that to help myself move forward or not. Okay, so we talked a little bit about anxiety. We talked a little bit about guilt. And then is there anything that we want to add or point out about people pleasing? Because you spend time doing work around that too.
People pleasing. I love it. So all the things that we've talked about so far, the anxiety, the guilt, all of those are I see them as little facets of the people pleasing umbrella, the way that I see it.
Yeah.
And people pleasing, I will say right off the bat, let's myth bust here. People pleasing is not all bad. It sounds like, no, that doesn't sound good, right? But it's a balancing act. There's a very evolutionary reason that we people please. If you really think about it, way, way back in the day, we needed other people to like us for our survival.
Yeah.
We cannot survive as singular beings. We need to be around people. And it also feeds into our sense of belongingness, right? So it's important to recognize that people pleasing on its own is not a bad thing. Everything is about a balance. You have to see things as a spectrum. So in our context, usually we label people as people pleasers when they're a little bit further on that spectrum and it's hurting them. So that's how I want to think about it. And that's how I tell clients to think about it as listen, this is a cool thing that you're doing. You want people like you. You're sweet. You're great with people. Awesome. But where do you fall on that spectrum? Is it serving you, this level of people pleasing you're at, or is it hurting you? Right. So when it's hurting us, usually this people pleasing comes from this form of fear of lots of fears, fear of disappointing others, fear of rejection, fear of not being liked, fear of, I could go on and on and on, but it's a very fear root based. So being able to really dig into people pleasing has to start from that emotional space of like, what is that emotion? Okay, well, this emotion is valid. We need to validate that emotion. We need to make space for that emotion. We need to really understand it. I always tell clients, if you could give this emotion a voice, what does it want us to know right now? And like, that's a really powerful thing because it helps them also separate from the emotion. You are not the emotion.
It'd be a crabby voice. It wouldn't be people pleasing happens, but it doesn't mean we're all happy, but we're doing it.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the other side of it too, right? It's like people pleasing isn't just like something we do out of the funness of our hearts and our kindness of our hearts. Sometimes if we're pushed too far in the scale, in that spectrum, we people please from a very resentful, angry place.
Yeah.
Been there, done that. I get it. I know.
Or we become martyrs then, right? Like it just, it doesn't go well.
It does not. No, because now you're unhappy. You don't have anything in your cup to pour into anybody else's. Now you're doing it from like a very burnt out, emotionally burnt out place.
Right.
And I think if there's one thing that really, I hope hits home for a lot of people pleasers, it's recognizing that we don't have to give it up. We can be in service of other people and in service of us. We can care for other people and care for us. Why do we have to choose? We don't. That's a misconception. The idea is, oh, they need me, so I need to be available. No, they need you. You can say, I can't right now, but how about in 20 minutes on my lunch break?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that really an unreasonable ask? No.
Right.
It's not. And like, that's a very simplistic example, but the idea remains.
Yeah.
Right? We can find a huge relief in the ands. It's not a this or that. It's the and. I care about you. I want to help you. And I'm going to need this much time to be able to give you my undivided attention.
Yeah.
There's a way to communicate our desire, our love for these people and wanting to be there for these people, wanting to do things for these people without feeling like we're constantly at their beck and call, depleting whatever our needs and wants are.
Yeah. What I just really like that you said about the and is I feel like I discovered this and because it's like the relating to the Western or Eastern world. So it's like we had to be one or the other. And only recently I'm trying to find the balance of the and. Like I can love Bollywood stuff and go do this Western thing over here. Yeah. And I think sometimes those of us that grow up in that world, you can see that people pleasing trait because we're trying to really, in a hard kind of fast form way, connect to what's coming before us, whether it's at school with certain kids. We want to avoid being bullied. We want to fit in. We want to look similar. And that's one way. That's my experience of getting to this place of people pleasing and then proving. It's like it's one or the other. And I have found it to be really depleting. And I think we sometimes in this kind of crappy place of realizing, we're people pleasers. Some of us realize a lot of it had to do with lack of identity, like not sure what I wanted, what I cared for, what music I wanted to listen to, what restaurant that day I wanted to go to. We grow up and we're told, be this way, take care of this person. And I think where you are in your sibling trajectory matters too. If you're the oldest, middle, youngest, only child, all the stuff, right? Like, so the big part of what you're really driving home, I feel, is that like being curious and leaning into where is this taking me and where could it be coming from and what do I want to do with this in between? So I find that quite, I think, helpful because I'm having like the wheels are turning. I'm like, oh crap, I got to sit down and write about this one now.
You got to journal after this. That's your homework.
That is literally my call to action. Seriously, like a true therapist would tell me, go journal now. And I know I kind of stopped and had my thought in there. So just to bring you back to what you were saying, if there's anything further you wanted to add to that as well.
I work with a lot of people pleasers. I have lots of observations, but if I really had to hone it in and package it up in the most concise way, that's what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey. Aw. So can we just shift for a second? So not only are you a therapist, not only are you on your socials teaching us psychoeducation about why we're doing the things we are, what we could do, You also are a co-host of a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's called Talk South Asian to Me.
Yeah.
Yeah, so can you take a couple minutes to share how did we start this podcast, how it's going so far, and where can we find you? Yeah.
I'd love to talk about it. This is awesome. So this actually started with my co-host, other than me, my other co-host is Mashal. She is a high school friend of mine, and we just kind of evolved as people, and like we've stayed in touch and we like meet up. And so we've kept our connection. And every time that we connect, every time we find a way to talk about mental health, and we find a way to like, this is what's happening. And like, oh my God, this is what I'm seeing. And like, we just have a real passion for mental health. Obviously for me, because I'm a therapist, but for her, it's because, she's just a like-minded person.
Yeah.
And we decided, and we kept talking back and forth. We're like, we should be a podcast. We talk about this all the time. We're so good at this. We're so good at that. And so we kept, yeah, exactly. That we kept talking about it. And one day, I guess, I don't remember exactly who said it, probably her, to be honest. She was like, screw it. Let's just do it. Like, what are we doing? We keep talking about it. Let's make it happen. And so we sat at I forget now, but like some pizza place. And we literally sat down eating our pizza and brainstorming. And that was literally the fruition of Talk South Asian to me. Aww. The idea really is normalizing. There was a lot of things that we've talked about where we felt there just wasn't a lot of normalizing happening, awareness, conversations being had about important topics about mental health. And we were in our own ways, like creating shifts within our own little families, but we really wanted to bring it about to more people, really talk to a community. And yeah, that's our mission. It's to normalize. And so what we do on our podcast is we have a very like educational portion where we pick a topic, and each of our episodes is chronological, alphabetical order.
Yeah.
A, B, C, D, E. Yeah. And we're on season 2 now. So we've done this almost 2 times fully, almost. It's been a really fun ride. And what we do is we do a very educational piece of like, okay, here's a topic. Here's a breakdown of what does this mean? What does this look like? And then we have a little bit of a piece where we relate it back to our South Asian community. How has it shown up in our communities?
Yeah.
What has it looked like? And then, again, normalizing means being vulnerable as you have these conversations. So we share our stories and how these things have impacted us. And some of these things, even though she's been my friend for quite some time now, some of these things are like, we don't share what we're going to say. So sometimes we're like, oh, I knew that about you. And sometimes we find out completely new information about each other. And it's super cool to see that on, like recording.
Yeah. Well, it goes to show there's always so much to learn. We think we know so much, right? And then here we are,
so much to unpack.
Surprised. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we thought it was like really perfect because, we're very similar, but we're also kind of like different. We're South Asian, yes, but she is a like Muslim Pakistani American born here. I'm a non-practicing Hindu Indian American born in India.
Yeah.
And so we have like different stories, but a lot of similar themes, I think, which makes for, I think, a really great co-host team together.
Yeah. I have had a chance to listen to your episode about intergenerational trauma, and you're consistent to exactly the structure that it was, a little bit of education, a little bit of strategies, and a personal story, and how, like you said, how we see it coming about in our community and all those kinds of things and where it shows up and all that. And I think that's like really important because there's a lot of ways to be educated today. And I just had a doctor on recently who is just really pushing this health literacy, because you can go on TikTok, you can go on socials, you can be any age and you can learn anything and everything, and lots of stuff contradicts. And so it's good to have quality work out there with, professionals like yourself who can kind of help guide the community along the way. And so what kind of feedback are you getting? What are people loving? What are people saying? And also like, what's next with the podcast?
Yeah, that's great questions. Usually a lot of the feedback is just about lots of love, lots of support, lots of like, oh my God, like that's so relatable. Like that really resonates. And so, I mean, awesome, because that clearly tells us we're on the right path here in terms of normalizing and validating. So that's been really awesome to see. And I think some of the more surprising ones is I get like relatives who might watch it and then come back and say like, oh, like I was thinking about this in terms of like what I can do for my kids now. And I'm like, amazing. I love that. Like we're doing what we wanted to do.
Yeah.
Which is normalize these conversations.
That's right.
Educate people.
Yeah.
It's great.
Yeah.
And yeah, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and the, trajectory where we're hoping to go now is we want to continue building on what we have been doing, but I think we want to get a little bit creative, and I'm not sure what that looks like yet, but we're brainstorming already for season 3, what that should look like, or what that not should, but what we want it to look like.
Right. Yeah.
And we've also this season started incorporating a few people who wanted to like jump on the podcast and like share their stories about things. So we've had 2 guest speakers this season, and maybe even building on that for next season.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah. Just getting different perspectives, professionals, personal stories. The nice thing is that there's so many different routes you can take along the way because there's a lot of content to be discussed for the community, and probably a lot of repetition as well because it's news. Like you said, the surviving versus the thriving. So if we are in that thriving era, then some of this we're going to need to hear it, see it, feel it a few times before it sticks. So that's amazing. Any challenges or anything that you 2 have learned that you weren't expecting to, experience or learn along the way?
Yeah, that's an awesome question because just the other day, I won't give away too much, but we did a episode on neurodiversity and I like looked it up, and I was in charge of the research that day because we like alternate, and I realized I'm neurodivergent. I had no idea until I did the research for the podcast. I was like, whoa, so cool. I'm learning things as
there
I'm
you go.
sharing.
Yeah. That's a huge one. So for anyone listening, maybe a breakdown of what that could mean.
Yeah. So neurodivergence essentially just means that in the simplest put terms, the way that we all process and think, the way that our brains work essentially can be different.
Yeah.
And like up until now, it was seen as maybe like kind of abnormal. But now we're really starting to hone in on these new terms, neurodivergent and neurotypical. Neurotypical being quote unquote what maybe you see in the norm more often what people have. Neurodivergent being people who think differently, process differently. So this can be people who like dyslexia, right? It could be things like ADHD. It can be things like the autism spectrum. It could be a lot of different things. I've also learned cool new phrases. I forgot them already. It's about, just like it's difficulty with reading with dyslexia, difficulty with math, difficulty with numbers, which was an interesting one. They have fancy names for them. I don't know what they are, but that's basically boiled down. Like all of these things exist, and these are all falling under the umbrella of like neurodivergence. And for me personally, I a while back discovered that I have I'm a highly sensitive person, HSP. Which means that my senses, so like my sense of smell, my sense of sight, my sense of hearing, things like that, I have a heightened sense of them. So I can't handle like sunlight too much. I have to have sunglasses, which is why I'm a fall girly. I do not like summer. I can't handle like too much noise. So I've recently, one of my clients actually, who's also HSP, she got me onto these things called loops. They look like AirPods, but they're just like little things that you put in your ear. And I have a really crazy story about that. We went to support one of my friends who's a stand-up comedian, and it was a really small venue. It was super loud. We were literally in the front, and I had them on the whole time. It was great. It was awesome. And I took them off just briefly to see what it was like. I was in pain. I was like 2 seconds. If I did not bring these for the first time, I would have been suffering my way through this or needed to like leave.
Oh my
so
gosh.
It makes a difference.
Yeah.
There are tools out there.
Yes. Like clearly there are, right?
Yeah. But we have to like acknowledge and be aware of what's happening and like normalizing like, okay, well, maybe that's an issue. Let's go find out.
Yeah.
Oh, it's not an issue. That's just the way that you are. Okay, well, what can we do about it?
Yeah.
So that's where this like whole neurodivergence era, so to speak, is coming about, is working with people who are neurodivergent and making their life more, manageable.
Totally.
Successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder too, like if now that there's so much more research out there and it does doesn't just end at ADD or ADHD. It's like you don't actually have to be diagnosed with either or. There's more to this. I wonder now if we can start to do some work in the education system, because we're not all learners of that mainstream schooling. And I think that's a huge thing that we're all learning, that those kids that have been coded behaviorally, kicked out of school, labeled all these sorts of things, their smartness wasn't any different. They just needed a different path. Your point being that there are tools, we have to be willing to talk about them and recognizing. And I think the other part too is that sometimes we say, well, that's just the way it is. And we don't do anything about it either. So you were talking about learning through some of your research for the podcast about some of the way that your development has happened and some of the, signs and maybe even traits along the way that you're like, oh, okay, this is why this is. And so I appreciate the message about we don't all have to be in this one box. And we're learning that while we have a similar development plan along the lifespan, we do have other differences because of our genes. They all make us up differently. So I think it's kind of cool to, be doing your own research and learn like, oh, this makes sense to, these sorts of things that I thought were bad, or why can't I ever go to a concert? What the heck? Now look, now you did your work and somebody gives you these things and you can go and see a comedy show and enjoy it.
There you go.
Right? Perfect. Okay. So anything else you want to add about your podcast before I start to wrap up with you? Because I've kept you too long.
I don't think so. That's pretty much a lot of it, other than come check us out.
So where can listeners find you?
We can be found on most platforms that you would listen to any podcast. So like, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and are there other podcasts? I don't know.
I know most of the basic platforms, right? Pretty much anywhere you find your music is where we can find you, right?
Yeah.
When do you release your episodes?
So our episodes go out every week on Thursdays. And then when we're on break between seasons, but every Thursday at 5:00.
Awesome.
Central time.
Perfect. And again, that's Talk South Asian to me. And also, while we're doing this, let's also talk about your socials. Where can people find you if they want to have chai with you?
Yeah. Come have chai with me on Instagram. My handle is @chai-with-Anusha. And I am also on TikTok, but I've only recently gotten on there. So I would say find me on Instagram.
Okay, so we talked about anxiety. We talked about guilt. We talked a little bit about people pleasing. If there was, anything that we were going to go back and share about these themes, your specialization, is there anything you would add to them, or anything that you want to go back and clarify that maybe we didn't get a chance to?
All I would really say is all of these things are quote unquote normal, in the sense that you will find others who experience it. We just need to find our balance in it. And so if you don't feel like you're balanced, maybe it's time to do something about that.
Love that. Perfect. And before we jump to a call to action, let's do your middle fingers up segment. So what do you want to put your middle fingers up to today?
I would say there's so many things, but I'll choose one. I will choose putting our middle fingers up today to our inner critic. The one that tells us that we're not good enough, the one that tells us we should or shouldn't be doing something, that we can't do something. I say put your middle finger up to that. You can.
Yeah, I'm going to join you. I'm putting my middle fingers up to that too, because that inner critic, seriously, can be tough.
Get you. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the next session.
Bully.
How to dodge the inner critic. That'll be next time together. Did you want to add anything to that, MFU? Anything you want to?
Well, if there's anything I would add to that, I would just say, if you think this is something that other people can do and that you would cheer for other people to do, you can do. Maybe you don't have the same exact skills yet, being the key word, but you can learn them. The growth mindset, whatever you want to do, you got this.
That's well said. Lastly, call to action. If there was one thing and only one thing our listeners were going to take today with this time we spent with you, what would you hope that one thing would be?
I would hope that they would take away the importance of being curious. That curiosity is where we really unlock compassion, awareness, and healing and change.
Oh, that's well said. Really well said. I want to thank you for coming on spending time with me, letting me ask you all the questions. I literally went rogue for a little while because my inner curiosity was like jumping out as you were talking about the things that hit home for so many of us, right? So how could I not be like, what about this? What about that? But I think there are things that probably so many share and so many of us feel. So I hope that others were able to take something from this. But also, people know these conversations are door openers. So if there's something that folks want to know more about, you know where you can reach us. You know where you can now reach Anusha. If you want to add to this conversation, you have any questions about them, you also know where to find us. So please reach out. We always appreciate the feedback. It's what keeps us going. Thank you so much. Any last words before we call it a day?
I would just say thank you. Thank you for having me on. Thank you for letting me talk about awesome things. Thank you for letting me normalize a bunch of things and educate a bunch of random things to your listeners. And yeah, I'm just really grateful to have this opportunity to keep talking about what I love and hopefully putting a little bit of good in the world.
Yeah, well, it all came from you putting out a comment and sharing, your feelings, your thoughts, being vulnerable out there. So thanks to people like you, people like me get to grow and thrive as well. So appreciate having you on. Hopefully you come back. We can talk about so many other things.
All right. Well, I will take that promise and I'll hold you to it.
Oh, I love it. I love it. All right. Well, thank you.